Hello and welcome to Inside Iraq. I'm Jassim Azzawi. On the eve of the war on Iraq, the Bush administration pledged not to stay a day longer than was necessary after its mission was accomplished. But the aims of its mission kept changing. And today, the US and the Iraqi governments are negotiating a bilateral agreement committing America to a long-term military presence in Iraq. The US Congress is up in arms for being sidelined. The Iraqi opposition says Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki is being short-sighted. So will US troops in Iraq contribute to the stability of the war-torn country? Or will the US military presence become a rallying cry for Iraqi resistance and terrorist groups to drive the occupiers out? So what lies behind this bilateral agreement? And what are the likely consequences of a continued US military presence in Iraq?
This firm handshake between President Bush and Prime Minister al-Maliki may seal what had been predicted all along, that the US has no intention of withdrawing from Iraq. Key to this agreement is a long-term US military presence in Iraq, which critics say will provide American oil companies and investment firms with preferential treatment in return for security guarantees.
Pursuant to the rule of the gentleman from Florida.
The U.S. Congress is angry that the White House appears to be committing future U.S. presidents to the current Bush policy. But the White House claims this is an agreement and not a treaty, and that the vote in 2002 to authorize war gives the Bush administration all the needed legal justifications to sign such an agreement.
It's sort of better from a public relations perspective to not sign such an agreement now, to wait until the U.S. military presence was more limited so that the agreement could be seen by the people of Iraq, by the Arab world, by the Muslim world, by the U.S. as a real legitimate agreement between equals. We don't have that now, and that's what makes this agreement seem a bit, this potential agreement seem a bit distasteful.
Despite increasingly vocal American anger against the war,
money for jobs and people, not for war.
President Bush is committing U.S. forces for an open-ended stay in Iraq in the shadow of November's U.S. presidential election, forcing the hand of the next incumbent of the White House.
No war, no warming. Resistance is forming.
It's a question of size. 20 Marines versus 200 Marines versus 2,000 versus 20,000. And I think if it's a small force of a few hundred people, a few hundred Marines, then I think the Arab world will just sort of accept it. If it's a large force that is acting on the streets, then it will clearly attract attention and inflame perhaps the same sentiments now that are causing the terrorist attacks in Iraq.
Prime Minister Maliki appears to be on shaky ground. An increasingly nationalist Iraqi parliament is unlikely to give him the mandate to sign such an agreement, opening the door for potential political coercion and enticements. The mutual U.S.-Iraqi plan for permanent U.S. bases in Iraq will only fuel the Iraqi resistance and energize other armed groups to attack not only U.S. forces, but Iraqi officials seen as accomplices of the occupiers. Owen Fay for Inside Iraq.
To discuss the implications of the agreement, I'm delighted to welcome from Washington retired General Richard Myers, who, as the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was the top American military officer when the U.S. invaded Iraq. And from San Francisco, As'ad Abu Khalil, professor of political science at California State University. Gentlemen, welcome to Inside Iraq. Richard Myers, was such an agreement in the cards before, during the planning period for the invasion, or this something developed just recently?
No, I think it was always sort of recognized that at some point, as Iraq became a sovereign nation, that there'd be more normal relationship between Iraq and its friends and allies in the world, to include the United States. And for the United States, the way that we normally codify those relationships is through a status of forces agreement, which is what we're talking about right now. So instead of operating under UN Security Council Chapter 7 resolution, I think Iraq has this desire to move to more normalized relations.
As'ad Abu Khalil, if such an agreement has been always in the cards, what does that do to the question of sovereignty? Do you see the linkage?
Well, of course it is, and I think that the usage of the term sovereign here is quite a canard. I don't think anybody who has any sense of international relations will look at Iraq today with the presence of some 160,000 American troops, and not to mention the other, and regard that as a sovereign nation. Sovereignty in any sense of the word is when a government can take its own decision. Just recently, there was a bill before the Iraqi parliament, and the Washington Post casually mentioned that it was drafted by the US government and then circulated among the members of the puppet parliament was set up. I think that no matter what kind of facade, no matter what kind of camouflage we place on the occupation, this is an American illegal occupation. Even America's allies and clients, like the Saudi king, have been admitting the obvious. And I think this is going to be regarded in historical terms as null and void, as the kind of agreement occupation troops sign with puppet governments they set up, whether the Soviets when they invaded Afghanistan, whether the Syrians when they intervened in Lebanon, and just after they left, all these agreements they signed have absolutely no meaning. I mean, the Americans may want us to believe that this is an international effort and there are United Nations resolutions that they were able to push through, but everybody knows, notwithstanding the presence of some 38 Mongolian soldiers who are part of the so-called international force, this is through and through an American occupation, and the Iraqi public are not permitted to express their genuine opinions about what's happening.
Richard Myers, the sentiment just heard represents not only the Arabs, but a big segment of the Iraqis too.
Well, it's interesting, you know, in terms of status of forces agreement, which is what we're talking about. I think the United States has, best of my knowledge, about 115 of those in effect around the world. And you have to be in a country under some authority. Right now it's Chapter 7 under a UN Security Council resolution, and the Iraqis said that is not acceptable past the end of this year. They won't ask for a renewal of that. And so to protect U.S. forces legally and to allow U.S. forces to do what the Iraqi government wants us to do, which is to help them train and equip, go after the al-Qaeda, and prevent Iranian arms and training from coming in from Iran into Iraq, that we need some sort of agreement if we're going to be there. Excuse me, just and this is a very normal thing. I mean, we have, like I said, 115 countries we have these agreements with. They don't change when our presidents change. I mean, they're just a basic agreement. They don't say anything about troop levels. They don't say anything about permanent basing.
Let me add to that, Asad Abu Khalil, this agreement was started by a request from al-Maliki himself, from the Iraqi government. That should count for something, doesn't it?
I mean, not really. I think that the Iraqi people are very aware. They do not like foreign intervention in their own affairs. And I think it is true what he mentioned. General Myers mentioned about these foreign troops and al-Qaeda terrorists who are trying to sneak into Iraq. And of course, the Iraqis don't want the mayhem that these people are causing. But Iraqis don't want foreign troops, period. So I don't think that, I mean, and notice that when they refer to foreign troops, they're only talking about al-Qaeda terrorists who are coming from neighboring countries. Does that make the U.S. troops over there in Iraq not foreign troops? If they are not foreign troops, what are they? Like heavily occupied tourists who just happen to be in that country? And General Myers said that there are certain agreements like this all around the world. Yes, you do have it with the kind of polygamous kingdoms of oppression throughout the Arab world and in other countries of the world. And this is why America's occupation of Iraq, far from bringing democracy to the Middle East or to Iraq itself, has in fact consolidated the tyrannical rule of all the clients of the United States throughout the region.
Professor, I think to go down your logic trail, you'd have to assume that Iraq would be better off without U.S. forces in there. And I don't think most Iraqis, certainly not the Iraqi government, thinks that's the case. I don't think most of the countries in the region think that's the case either, although, as you know well, they will think one thing in private and they'll either not say anything or say something else in public. I asked a question when I was getting ready for this program. I mean, do we have support of the Gulf states for a status of forces agreement between the United States and Iraq? And the answer I got was, yes, we do. And you know, there were some high-level visitors to that part of the world here just recently, and they've gotten that support. I don't disagree at all that anytime you have a foreign entity in your backyard that's heavily armed, that is not an ideal state. And from the time we went into Iraq, I think trying to balance this whole idea between occupiers and liberators was one of those very, very tough calls. And you know, I still get criticized. Well, you put too few troops in there, and part of that was was supporting our combatant commanders who thought, our most thoughtful ones thought that, gee, you put too many troops in there and you're going to be occupiers and you'll never gain the confidence of the population. So it's a fine balancing act between providing some stability and being too overbearing.
That is the point, in fact. And I think it's quite inaccurate when you refer to Iraqi public opinion. I am sure you're knowledgeable enough to know that Iraqi public opinion surveys have increasingly indicated that overwhelmingly the Iraqis just don't want the American troops in their country. They don't want Iranians, they don't want Al-Qaeda, and they don't want, with all due respect to the Americans, I know this may hurt your feelings, but they just don't want American occupation. It is an occupation. That's how they regard it.
My feelings.
When you refer to, in support of the agreement, to Maliki, I mean, Maliki is part of the setup that the Americans put in place. We are not trying to fool anybody here. This is an international audience which follows international affairs and is far more informed than, say, Fox News. The second point, you make a reference to Arab Gulf governments who say one thing in private and something else in public. I don't disagree with you at all. These are governments that are based on deception and lies to their own people. Are we going to take the opinion of unrepresentative, unelected governments that still practice weekly beheadings in public squares like in Saudi Arabia as a measure of public opinion? If this is what you are relying on, the entire process of American policy is flawed and based on weak foundations.
Thank you, Asad Abu Khalil. We'll take a short break now. When we come back, I'm going to ask Richard Myers what role U.S. troops are going to play in Iraq. Stay with us.
President Bush's agreement with the Iraqi government confirms his willingness to leave office with the U.S. Army tied down in Iraq and stretched to the breaking point with no clear exit strategy. Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives.